You've been told that good deeds are rewarded. That's a lie sold to children. The truth is, doing the right thing usually costs you everything. Nora knew this. She knew stepping off that curb would ruin her life. But the man was bleeding, and everyone else just kept walking. The cheap polyester of Nora's skirt suit trapped the morning humidity against her skin, making her itch just below the collarbone. It smelled faintly of chemical dry cleaning solvent and the stale coffee she'd spilled on the subway platform 20 minutes earlier. She adjusted the strap of her cracked leather tote bag, feeling the heavy, crisp weight of the 10 resumes printed on heavy stock paper inside. 10 copies. 10 chances to convince someone she wasn't just another desperate liability. It was 8:38 a.m. The air in the financial district tasted like diesel exhaust and damp concrete. Horns blared in a disjointed, aggressive rhythm, echoing off the glass facades of the skyscrapers towering above. Nora was exactly 2 blocks away from the towering obsidian glass of the Langdon and Wright building. A corner office, a junior logistics coordinator role. It paid $72,000 a year. That number had been echoing in her skull for 3 days. $72,000 meant moving out of the basement apartment where the ceiling wept brown water every time it rained. It meant buying her 6-year-old Toby the asthma medication he needed without having to calculate which bills she'd have to skip that month. It meant breathing. She walked fast, her low, sensible heels clicking a frantic tempo against the pavement. The wind whipped a loose strand of dark hair across her mouth. She tasted cheap lip gloss and salt. Up ahead, at the intersection of 5th and Mercer, the crosswalk signal flashed a red hand. The crowd of commuters thickened, pressing shoulder to shoulder, a solid wall of beige trench coats, black wool pea coats, and eyes glued to glowing phone screens. Nora wedged herself near the curb, checking the digital clock on her lock screen again. 8:41 a.m. Her interview was at 9 a.m. sharp. She had timed this down to the minute. Then, the sound. It wasn't a loud crash. It was a dense, sickening thud, followed by the sharp crack of plastic fracturing against concrete. Nora flinched, her head snapping to the left. An older man had gone down. Hard. He lay sprawled half on the sidewalk, half in the gutter. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored charcoal suit, but the dignity of his clothing was entirely shattered by the awkward broken angle of his limbs. A black leather briefcase had burst open beside him, spilling a mess of file folders, a silver fountain pen, and scattered white papers across the damp, filthy street grating. Nora stared. Her breath hitched. Get up, she thought, just get up. But he didn't. He was trying to push himself up, his pale hands trembling violently against the pavement, but his arms gave out. He collapsed back down, his cheek slamming into the concrete. A thin, bright line of crimson began to pool near his right temple, vivid and shocking against the gray stone. And the crowd? They flowed around him like water around a stone. A young man in a tailored vest sidestepped the man's legs, barely glancing up from his AirPods. A woman holding a tray of lattes clicked her tongue in annoyance, stepping delicately over the scattered papers so she wouldn't scuff her suede boots. Someone muttered, "Drunk," under their breath. Nora froze. Her stomach twisted into a tight, agonizing knot. "Walk away," a voice in her head hissed. It sounded just like her mother. "You have an interview, Nora. You have Toby to think about. This is not your problem." She took a step forward, toward the glass tower, toward $72,000 a year. The man on the ground let out a sound. It was a wet, ragged gasp, desperate for air. He rolled onto his back, his eyes rolling back slightly. His chest heaved in shallow, erratic jerks. He wasn't drunk. He was dying. Nora stopped. She hated him in that moment. She genuinely, bitterly hated this stranger for falling in front of her. She looked at the skyscraper. She looked at the man. She felt the heavy stock paper in her bag. "Damn it!" she hissed through her teeth. "Damn it! Damn it!" She shoved her way backward through the stream of pedestrians. "Move!" she snapped, slamming her shoulder into a businessman who refused to yield. "Move out of the way!" She dropped to her knees right in the gutter. The cold, wet slime of the street instantly seeped through her cheap tights, chilling her skin. Up close, the man smelled like expensive sandalwood cologne and the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood. He was older than she thought, maybe late 60s. His skin was the color of old parchment, slick with a clammy, unnatural sweat. "Hey," Nora said, her voice shaking. She grabbed his shoulder, the wool of his suit surprisingly soft beneath her rough, anxious fingers. "Hey, can you hear me? Look at me." His eyelids fluttered. His lips were turning a faint, terrifying shade of blue. He reached up with a violently trembling hand and gripped her wrist. His fingers were ice cold. He tried to speak, but only a dry click came from his throat. "Help!" Nora screamed, looking up at the crowd. The faces blurred past, eyes averting, footsteps quickening. Nobody wanted to be involved. "Somebody call 911. He's not breathing right." A teenager paused, pulling his phone out, but Nora didn't wait. She yanked her own cracked smartphone from her pocket. Her hands were shaking so badly, she dropped it once, the screen cracking further against the pavement. She snatched it up and dialed. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. A bored, nasal voice. 911, what is your emergency?" A man collapsed. "Fifth and Mercer," Nora barked, pressing 2 fingers to the man's neck. His pulse was a frantic, terrifying flutter, like a trapped bird beating itself to death against a cage. He hit his head. He's barely breathing. His skin is cold. I think it's a heart attack. Or sugar. I don't know. Ambulance is dispatched, ma'am. Stay with him. Is he conscious? Barely. Nora looked down. The man was staring at her now. His eyes were a startling pale gray. They were filled with absolute naked terror. He didn't want to die here, in the dirt, ignored by the world. Nora grabbed his hand, squeezing it hard. "Hold on," she ordered him, her voice cracking. "They're coming. Just breathe. Focus on my voice." From her coat pocket, her phone vibrated. An alarm. 8:45 a.m. Final warning. Walk in now. Nora stared at the screen as the little digital letters glowed. She swiped it away, her thumb smearing a drop of the old man's blood across the cracked glass. The ambulance took 12 minutes to arrive. It felt like 12 hours. By the time the heavy EMTs pushed through the crowd, dragging their canvas kits and a collapsible gurney, Nora's knees were entirely numb from the freezing pavement. The man, whom the paramedics found a wallet on and identified as Arthur, had drifted into a hazy semi-consciousness. "His pressure is tanking," the taller EMT shouted over the roar of the morning traffic, strapping a blood pressure cuff to Arthur's limp arm. "We gotta move! Now!" They hoisted him onto the gurney. As they did, Arthur's fingers suddenly clamped around the strap of Nora's cracked leather tote bag. His grip was shockingly strong, a desperate vice born of sheer panic. "Sir, let go," the EMT said, trying to pry his fingers away. Arthur just groaned, his eyes rolling blindly toward Nora, his grip tightening until his knuckles went white. "He's in shock," the second EMT said, looking at Nora. "Are you family?" "No," Nora said, her voice hollow. "I just found him. We need to get him in the rig. He won't let go of your bag. Ride with us. We need someone who saw what happened for the ER intake anyway." Nora looked up at the towering glass of the Langdon and Wright building. It was exactly 2 blocks away. She checked her watch. 8:58 a.m. If she ran, she would be exactly 2 minutes late. She could make an excuse. She could tell them she saw an accident. Let go of the bag, she told herself. Leave it. Just run. But she looked down at Arthur. The blood was drying in a crust across his temple. His breathing was a horrific, rattling wheeze. He looked so incredibly small on that gurney. He looked like Toby did when his asthma flared up in the middle of the night, terrified, clinging to the nearest anchor. Nora let out a long, ragged exhale. It sounded like a sob. "Fine," she whispered. "I'll come." The inside of the ambulance smelled intensely of iodine, sterile plastic, and copper. Nora sat on the hard bench, bouncing with every pothole, watching the EMTs work frantically to push an IV into Arthur's arm. The siren wailed above them, a deafening shriek that drowned out her thoughts. She pulled out her phone. 9:04 a.m. She scrolled to the email from Langdon and Wright HR. She found the phone number at the bottom of the signature block. Her thumb hovered over it for a second. She pressed call. It rang 4 times before a crisp, heavily rehearsed voice answered. "Human Resources, this is Jillian." "Hi," Nora said, raising her voice over the siren. "This is Nora Harding. I have a 9 o'clock interview for the Junior Logistics Coordinator position. There was a medical emergency on the street. I had to wait for an ambulance. I'm so sorry, but I won't be able to make it right at 9. Can I?" "Miss Harding," the voice cut in. It wasn't angry. It was worse. It was utterly indifferent. "Our policy is very strict regarding punctuality. We are interviewing 40 candidates for this role today." "I understand," Nora pleaded, her voice cracking. "But a man collapsed. I couldn't just leave him." "We appreciate your situation, but the hiring manager has already marked you as a no-show. We do not reschedule initial rounds. We wish you the best of luck in your job search." Click. Nora sat there holding the phone to her ear long after the line went dead. The dial tone hissed in her ear. She lowered the phone. A heavy, suffocating weight settled in her chest. It physically hurt. It felt like she had swallowed a stone. She looked at her reflection in the glass cabinet across from her. Her hair was a mess. There was a smear of street dirt on her cheek. The knee of her cheap tights was torn completely open, revealing a scraped, bruised kneecap. "You idiot," she thought, the tears finally welling up, hot and bitter. "You absolute stupid idiot." She had done it. She had thrown away the only lifeline she had managed to grasp in 8 months. Toby's winter coat was too small. The electricity bill was due in 5 days. And she had traded their future for a stranger who would forget her face the second the morphine hit his bloodstream. The ambulance slammed to a halt, the back doors flying open to reveal the glaring fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Emergency Bay. The next 2 hours were a blur of apathetic nurses, squeaking rubber shoes, and the overwhelming smell of floor wax. Nora sat in a plastic chair in the corner of a chaotic trauma bay, watching doctors swarm Arthur. They got him stabilized. "Severe hypoglycemic shock exacerbated by minor head trauma," a doctor muttered to a nurse. "He's lucky someone called it in when they did. 5 more minutes on the pavement, and his heart would have stopped. Nora heard the words, but they brought her zero comfort. She felt no heroic glow. She felt only a hollow, scraping resentment. Eventually, the doctors filed out, leaving Arthur hooked up to a monitor that beeped in a steady, monotonous rhythm. The curtain was pulled back. Nora stood up. She walked over to the bed. Arthur's eyes were open. He looked exhausted, the color slowly returning to his face, though he still looked incredibly frail beneath the thin hospital blanket. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes locking onto hers. They were lucid now, sharp despite the exhaustion. "You!" His voice was a dry, gravelly rasp. "You stayed." Nora stared down at him. Her hands were balled into fists inside her coat pockets. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tell him exactly what his life had cost hers. "I stayed because you grabbed my bag and wouldn't let go," Nora said. Her tone was flat, cold. The empathy had been entirely burned out of her by the phone call with HR. The EMTs needed a witness. Arthur blinked, taking in her appearance. He saw the torn tights, the ruined, dirt-stained skirt, the way her shoulders slumped under an invisible, crushing weight. "You're angry," he noted quietly. "I'm tired," Nora corrected, turning away to grab her cracked leather tote from a nearby plastic chair. "I filled out your intake forms as a John Doe. The nurses have my number if they need to ask about the fall. I have to go." "Wait," Arthur said. He tried to sit up, wincing as the IV pulled at his skin. "Please, what is your name?" Nora paused at the edge of the curtain. She looked back at him, the bitter reality of her mourning cementing in her throat. "It doesn't matter," she said. "Just take better care of yourself, okay? Not everyone is going to stop." She pushed through the curtain and walked out into the cold, unforgiving city, pulling out her phone to check her bank balance. $34. She had exactly $34 to her name. The subway ride back to Queens smelled of wet copper and stale urine. Nora sat perfectly rigid on the cracked orange plastic seat, staring at the scuffed toes of her pumps. She didn't cry. Crying required energy, a luxury she couldn't afford on $34. Instead, a cold, hollow numbness spread through her limbs, heavy as lead. The metallic screech of the train rounding the bend at 42nd Street usually set her teeth on edge, but today it barely registered. She was calculating. Rent was due in 6 days. $850 for an illegal basement sublet. Groceries for the week. $30 if they ate rice and beans for dinner every night. Toby's inhaler refill. $45 out of pocket because her state insurance lapsed 3 weeks ago. The math didn't work. The math hadn't worked since Toby's father walked out 4 years ago, taking the last of their savings and leaving behind a chipped coffee mug and a mountain of unpaid utility bills. She got off at Astoria Boulevard. The afternoon sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, the humidity breaking into a cold, spitting drizzle. By the time Nora reached Mrs. Gable's apartment building, the shoulders of her cheap blazer were soaked through. Mrs. Gable lived on the first floor. Her apartment permanently smelled of boiled cabbage, menthol cigarettes, and medicinal rubbing alcohol. When Nora knocked, the door cracked open to reveal the elderly woman's deeply lined face, a cigarette clamped tightly between her teeth. "You're early," Mrs. Gable rasped, her eyes scanning Nora's ruined tights and mud-stained skirt. "Look like you lost a fight with a taxi, hun." "Something like that," Nora muttered, handing over a crumpled $10 bill. "Is he ready?" Toby appeared behind Mrs. Gable's legs. He was small for a 6-year-old, his collarbone sharp against the fabric of his faded superhero t-shirt. He had Nora's dark hair, but his father's wide, trusting eyes. Right now, those eyes were fixed on the state of her clothes. "Mommy, you fell," he said softly, reaching out to touch the dried mud on her skirt. "Just a clumsy morning bug." Nora forced a smile, though her facial muscles felt rigid, like cracking porcelain. She grabbed his small, warm hand. It felt impossibly fragile. "Let's go home." Their basement apartment was exactly 4 blocks away. Walking down the concrete steps into the subterranean entrance, Nora felt the familiar suffocating drop in air pressure. The door swelled in the damp weather, forcing her to ram her shoulder against the cheap wood to get it open. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the metallic scent of rust from the exposed pipes overhead. Nora locked the dead bolt, dropping her heavy leather tote bag onto the scratched linoleum floor with a dull thud. "Homework at the table," Nora instructed, kicking off her damp heels. Her arches throbbed in slow, agonizing pulses. "I'll make dinner." "Did you get the big desk job?" Toby asked, climbing onto a mismatched wooden dining chair. He pulled a crumpled worksheet from his backpack. Nora froze by the kitchen counter. Her hand hovered over the box of generic macaroni and cheese. She closed her eyes. The urge to scream, to shatter the chipped plates in the sink against the cinder block wall, was a living, breathing thing in her throat. She swallowed it down. It tasted like battery acid. "No, Bug," she said, keeping her back to him as she filled a dented aluminum pot with water. The faucet shrieked as she turned it off. "They went with someone else." "Oh." Toby's voice was remarkably small. He didn't complain. He just picked up his pencil. That was the worst part. He was already used to disappointment. Nora struck a match and held it to the faulty gas burner. It caught with a gentle whump, bathing her face in a harsh blue light. She dumped the pasta into the boiling water, staring blankly at the rolling bubbles. She had traded her son's stability for the life of a man who probably had a team of lawyers and a private chef waiting for him at home. The sheer injustice of it made her stomach twist into a tight, sickening knot. By 7 p.m., Toby was asleep in the tiny bedroom they shared, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, slightly wheezy rhythm. Nora sat at the kitchen table under the harsh glare of a single, bare 60-watt bulb. She had a stack of late notices in front of her and exactly 3 crumpled dollar bills and a handful of quarters spread across the table. Her phone buzzed against the wood. She flinched. The screen was spiderwebbed with cracks from dropping it on the pavement that morning. An unknown number flashed on the caller ID, a Manhattan area code. For a second, a desperate, pathetic flare of hope ignited in her chest. Langdon and Wright HR. They made a mistake. They saw my resume. She swiped the screen with a trembling thumb. "Hello?" Nora Harding. The voice was not the crisp, robotic HR woman from this morning. It was male. It was gravelly, dry, and carried an unmistakable undertone of authority, even though it sounded exhausted. Nora's spine stiffened. She recognized the raspy timbre immediately. "Arthur," she breathed. Her hand tightened around the phone. The hope instantly evaporated, replaced by a surge of hot, unadulterated anger. "How did you get this number?" "You left your ruined tote bag at the hospital," the man replied. The line was quiet, no hospital background noise. "You dropped a few things when you ran out. A tube of cheap lip gloss, a cracked compact, and 10 copies of a very impressive resume." Nora's jaw clenched. "Throw it away and lose my number." "You missed an interview this morning," Arthur continued, ignoring her hostility. His voice was entirely level. "At 9 o'clock. for a junior logistics coordinator position. I'm assuming the medical emergency you cited to the receptionist was me." "It doesn't matter," Nora snapped, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You're alive. Congratulations. Mail the bag to the address on the resume if you feel guilty. Don't call me again." "I am not calling to apologize, Nora," he said. The sheer arrogance in his tone made her see red. "I am calling to tell you to look out your window." Nora froze. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She slowly lowered the phone, turning her head toward the small rectangular window set high on the basement wall. It looked out onto street level. Parked flush against the curb, directly in front of her building, was a massive, sleek black town car. Its hazard lights blinked in a slow, silent rhythm, casting amber reflections against the wet pavement. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed on her apartment door. Nora didn't move. The knock came again. 3 precise, heavy raps against the hollow wood. It sounded like a demand, not a request. She looked at the sleeping form of Toby in the next room, then down at the table, at the $34 mocking her from the scratched formica. She shoved the money into her pocket, grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the shelf by the door, and unlatched the deadbolt. She yanked the door open, keeping the chain engaged. Standing in the dingy, flickering, fluorescent light of the hallway was not a delivery driver. It was Arthur. He looked entirely out of place, like a museum piece dropped into a landfill. He was no longer wearing the bloody, ruined suit from the gutter. He wore a heavy, dark cashmere overcoat that hung slightly loose on his frame. A stark white bandage was taped securely over his right temple. He leaned heavily on a silver-tipped mahogany cane, his breathing shallow but steady. Flanking him was a towering man in a dark suit, eyes scanning the hallway with professional indifference. "You checked yourself out of the hospital," Nora said flatly through the 2-inch gap in the door. "St. Jude's smells like bleach and despair. I prefer my own despair," Arthur replied. His pale gray eyes locked onto hers, sharp and calculating. "Undo the chain, Nora. I have a 6-year-old asleep in the next room, and I have no idea who you actually are. You're lucky I don't call the cops. If you call the police, they will see my driver, David, illegally parked out front, write a ticket I won't feel, and leave. You, however, will still be unemployed, and you will still be angry." Arthur leaned slightly closer to the gap. The faint scent of sandalwood wafted into the damp apartment. "Undo the chain. I have something that belongs to you." He held up a pristine, heavy-stock manila envelope. Nora stared at the envelope. She hated that she wanted it. She hated that her survival instincts were loud enough to override her pride. Her fingers trembled as she slid the chain free and opened the door wide. David, the driver, remained in the hallway. Arthur stepped over the threshold, his leather shoes clicking against the warped linoleum. He paused in the center of the tiny kitchen, his eyes scanning the water-stained ceiling, the exposed pipes, the generic mac and cheese box crushed in the trash can. He didn't sneer. He just observed, absorbing the geometry of her poverty. "I read your resume," Arthur said, turning back to face her. He didn't sit down. 7 years managing supply chains for a mid-tier shipping firm. You rebuilt their entire East Coast routing matrix in your 2nd year. Then, an 18-month employment gap. My son got sick. His father left. The firm wouldn't let me work remote, so I quit to take care of him. Nora crossed her arms over her chest, the brass candlestick still resting heavily in her right hand. "I don't need a career consultation from a man who doesn't know how to cross the street." A faint, dry chuckle escaped Arthur's chest. It ended in a wince. You have a vicious mouth, Nora Harding. You cost me $72,000 a year today. Nora stepped forward, the anger finally spilling over the dam. The hollow numbness vanished, replaced by a searing, white-hot fury. I missed the final cutoff by 4 minutes. Because I was kneeling in a puddle of street sludge holding your hand so you wouldn't die alone. They blacklisted me for being late. I know, Arthur said. You don't know anything, Nora hissed, pointing a finger at his chest. You live in a world where a bad day means a hospital visit and a black car ride home. A bad day for me means my kid doesn't get his asthma medication. It means we freeze. You ruined my life today, Arthur. So leave the envelope on the table and get out of my apartment. Arthur didn't flinch. He watched her chest heave, watching the raw, unfiltered desperation radiate off her. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out the ruined, blood-stained copies of her resume he had salvaged from her bag. He tossed them onto the kitchen table next to the envelope. The HR coordinator you spoke to this morning is named Jillian, Arthur said quietly. She was following a strict directive. 0 tolerance for tardiness in the final interview rounds. The directive was implemented 2 weeks ago to weed out liabilities. Nora's brow furrowed. How do you know her name? Because I signed the directive. Arthur leaned heavily on his cane, the gray eyes burning into hers. My name isn't just Arthur. It's Arthur Langdon. I am the CEO of Langdon and Wright. The room went entirely silent. The only sound was the distant rhythmic dripping of the leaky faucet in the kitchen sink. Drip, drip, drip. Nora stared at him. Her brain scrambled to process the words, to align the dying, fragile old man in the gutter with the titan whose name was etched in obsidian glass 50 stories above the financial district. You, she whispered. The irony was so immense it felt suffocating. You own the company. I was walking from my townhouse to the office to personally oversee the final panel when my blood sugar crashed, Arthur said, his tone devoid of ego, stating mere facts. I collapsed, and a city full of my own employees, competitors, and peers walked right over me. Except you. Nora felt a bitter laugh claw its way up her throat. So what is this? The part where you play God? You hand me the junior coordinator job as a reward for being a good Samaritan? No. Arthur's voice cracked like a whip. You're entirely unqualified for the junior coordinator role. Nora flinched as if he had struck her. You're unqualified because you're too smart for it, Arthur continued, his eyes narrowing. I read your routing matrix data. It's aggressive. It's ruthless. You understand logistics better than the vice president I currently have running my East Coast division. The junior role would bore you, and you'd quit in 6 months. He tapped the thick manila envelope on the table with the tip of his cane. That is a contract, Arthur said. For the director of East Coast operations, the salary is $180,000 a year, plus a comprehensive medical package that covers pediatric pulmonology. Nora stopped breathing. The walls of the basement seemed to tilt inward. She looked at the envelope. It looked like a bomb. Why? Nora demanded, her voice barely a whisper. She refused to touch it. Because I saved your life? Because you hated me for it, and you saved me anyway. Arthur stepped closer, his imposing frame looming over her. I saw your face on that pavement, Nora. You looked at the building, you looked at me, and you were furious. You knew exactly what it was going to cost you to stop. You did the math. You didn't stay out of blind kindness. You stayed because you have a spine of absolute steel. He reached out, his cool, dry fingers brushing the edge of the envelope, pushing it an inch toward her. I don't need saints at Langdon and Wright. the CEO said softly. I need people who can calculate the cost of a disaster and still make the hardest, ugliest choice without blinking. You start on Monday. Do not be late. Nora stared at the manila envelope. It looked toxic, radioactive, $180,000. It felt insulting, a fictional sum conjured to mock the 34 real dollars in her pocket. She didn't reach for it. Her grip on the candlestick tightened, the cold brass grounding her in the reality of the damp, peeling kitchen. What's the catch? She asked. Her voice didn't waver. It was the deadened tone of a woman who had been lied to her entire adult life. Arthur leaned heavily on his cane, a muscle feathering in his jaw as the hospital-grade painkillers wore off. The catch is the vice president you'll be replacing, Richard Galt. He is deeply entrenched, liked by the board, and he has been bleeding the East Coast routing division dry with kickbacks for 4 years. I need someone to gut his department. They will hate you. You will be a pariah. The hours will be vicious. You want a hatchet, man, Nora said. I want a scalpel. Arthur's pale gray eyes were cold. Galt thinks I'm too old and sentimental to fire him. I want you to walk in on Monday and prove him wrong. If you fail, I will fire you without severance. If you fold under the pressure, you will be back in this basement by Christmas. Nora stared at him. This felt real. The cruelty of it made sense. Charity was a trap, but a corporate bloodbath? That was a transaction. That was a language she understood. She lowered the candlestick with a heavy clunk. The envelope's thick, textured paper felt like a completely different world. She slid her thumb under the flap and ripped it open. The sound was violently loud. 3 pages of dense legal jargon. And there it was, Nora Harding, Director of East Coast Operations, base salary $180,000. Pediatric pulmonology, Nora murmured, her eyes tracing the benefits section. The ink blurred for a fraction of a second. Top tier, Arthur confirmed, voice raspy. Includes Dr. Aris Miller at Mount Sinai. Best in the state. From the bedroom, Toby coughed, a dry, rattling hack fighting the mold spores in the drywall. Nora flinched. The instinct to protect rose up, hot and absolute. Arthur didn't offer empty platitudes. He just waited. Nora grabbed a chewed-up ballpoint pen from a cracked mug on the counter. I need an advance, she said, her voice stripped of emotion. $5,000, today, to get us out of this basement. The damp is making his asthma worse. Arthur didn't blink. He reached inside his heavy cashmere coat, pulled out a leather checkbook, and uncapped the exact silver fountain pen she had seen rolling in the blood-stained gutter. He wrote with precise, sharp strokes, tore the check free, and placed it over the crushed mac and cheese box. Consider it a signing bonus, he said. Nora signed the contract. Her signature was jagged, a violent scrawl across the bottom line. She felt no triumph, only the terrifying weight of a massive gamble. She pushed one copy toward him, folding the other into her pocket next to her crumpled bills. Arthur slid his copy into his coat. He looked exhausted, his posture finally sagging under the adrenaline crash of the day. David will be outside at 7:30 Monday morning, Arthur said, turning toward the door. He will drive you. Do not wear that suit. I don't have another one, she shot back, her chin lifting. Then buy one, he replied, nodding at the check. You're a director now. Act like it. He opened the door. David stepped forward from the shadows, offering a supportive arm. Arthur waved him off. Before stepping over the threshold, he paused. I meant what I said, Nora. You're not a hero. I never claimed to be, she said, her voice like grinding stones. Good. Heroes get eaten alive in this city. Survivors run it. The door clicked shut, the deadbolt rattling in its loose frame. Silence rushed back in, heavy and ringing. The smell of boiled cabbage still hung in the air, but beneath it lingered the crisp scent of sandalwood and old money, the ghost of a different life. Nora looked at the table. $5,000. 5,000. Her knees gave out. She sank into the wobbly chair, hands shaking violently. She didn't cry. Instead, a ragged, breathless laugh ripped out of her throat. It sounded manic, ugly, and raw. It sounded like survival. She pressed the rigid check to her chest, right over her thudding heart, and squeezed her eyes shut. The bedroom door creaked open. Toby stood in the doorway, clutching his faded dinosaur blanket, rubbing a sleepy eye. Mommy? Who was that? Nora took a trembling breath. For the first time in 4 years, the basement didn't feel like it was suffocating her. She knelt on the cold linoleum and pulled him into a fierce hug. His bones felt fragile, but she swore right then she would build a titanium fortress around them. Just a man, Nora whispered against his hair. Just a man who got lost. Are we still having mac and cheese? He asked, muffled against her shoulder. Nora pulled back. A genuine smile, the first real one in months, finally cracked the rigid mask she had worn all day. No, Bug, she said, her voice thick but steady. We're going to order pizza, the good kind. The world doesn't reward blind kindness. It rewards the grit to make the hard choice when everything is on the line. If Nora's raw, unapologetic survival hit home for you, don't just keep scrolling. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone grinding through their own dark chapter. Drop a comment below. Would you have sacrificed your one shot to save a stranger? Stay strong, and we'll see you next time.